I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. Imagine that you're at a restaurant. And you've been really excited about this booking because you made it months ago. But when you show up, they ask you to sit in a room and fill out pages of paperwork about yourself. And when you finally get seated at your table, the server comes over and tells you that they're too busy to take your order. And instead, they'll bring you whatever happens to be available that they think you'll like. And that's all well and good, but when the final bill comes, it turns out they ordered you the most expensive thing on the menu. Oh yeah, and this whole meal, it only lasts 8 minutes before they ask you to leave to make room for the next set of guests. Open your eyes. You wouldn't go to this restaurant more than once, would you? Or maybe some of you would. I certainly wouldn't. But how about this hospital or this doctor's office? So as you might have guessed, this isn't a real restaurant. I modeled it on the experience of healthcare faced by patients in America every single day. And if you're wondering why I made this analogy between the hospital and the restaurant, because they're clearly very different, I find it useful because at a restaurant we know that there is so much more to an experience than just being fed. But in the hospital, the priority has been in fixing the person rather than on engagement and satisfaction. So what happens when we put the patient experience first? Well, we've been finding that when we do that, we can get people healthier faster and keep them healthier for longer. I'm a journalist with CNBC in Silicon Valley, and I write about how the big tech companies like Apple and Google are moving into healthcare for the first time with a focus on the patient experience. But by far, the favorite part that I have of my job is in talking to the entrepreneurs and the innovators that are trying to fix this, because they all have one thing in common, and that is a personal brush with a broken system, whether it's them or more often, it's with a loved one, like a mother, a brother, a sister, or a friend. So entrepreneurs want to disrupt everything, but healthcare is one of the hardest sectors to change. And there are many, many complicated reasons for this, but a simple one is tradition. For a very long time, we've had a system of medicine called paternalism, in which the doctor knows best and the patient is assumed to know very little. Back in the 1960s, not that long ago, it was very common for doctors to think it was in the best interest of their patient to not tell them that they had a diagnosis of cancer and go ahead and treat them accordingly. Take a moment to imagine not knowing that you had a potentially fatal disease. Now we've made some really huge strides since then with the rise of ideas around informed consent and patients' rights movements, but we still have a long way to go. And this system of paternalism has manifested in a lot of different ways, and some of them you'll recognize from your own experiences of healthcare. Would you believe that the average time that doctors spend with their patients during a typical visit is between 8 and 15 minutes? Now that might seem like a decent amount of time, but it's far less than I'm talking with you today. And in 8 minutes, think about everything that you'd want to cover in that visit. For some of us, it's only once a year. You might want to talk about how you've been feeling recently, whether you need a medication or some kind of treatment, whether or not you should even be taking a medication in the first place. How about some of the stresses that you've been experiencing at work? Maybe you've recently lost your job or been through a breakup. You might want to touch on that too, because it has an impact on your health. And how about coming up with some shared goals, some simple ways that you can hack your health to feel better in the future? Typically, all we have time for, though, is a quick checklist of your symptoms and a set of instructions. Go home, take this pill, and continue taking it until the bottle is empty. So consider the absurdity of this fact. More people have had their medical records hacked than have ever seen them. Hackers have an easier time than you and I in looking at our own health information. And the reason for that is because these IT systems were not set up for the purpose of making it easy for doctors and patients to communicate with each other, or for patients to view the information that they should have a right to have. Instead, they make it easier for hospital administrators to bill you. And in many countries, even ones that are as progressive as a country like Norway, it's only been very recently that we've started to make it possible for people to view their medical records online. But rather than continue to focus on these problems, I wanted to shift to the solutions. And to do that, I wanted to introduce you to someone that I've met during my job as a journalist who is confronting these realities every day. And it's a doctor. His name is Tom Delbanco. And he had this really crazy radical idea back in the 70s that you, the patient, should be able to view your doctor's notes. Right now, we have no idea what the hell our doctors are scribbling in those paper notebooks or on the computer, but he thought that you should have a right to view this. And when he initially proposed the idea, he was met with a lot of resistance. Many of his peers thought that if patients were to read these notes, they would become crazy and anxious and maybe even offended. You know, what would happen if a patient read that their doctor thought that they were obese? Or how about some medical terminology like SOB, which means one thing to you and I, and shortness of breath in medical terminology. But it's now been 40 years, and guess what? Pretty much nothing has happened. It's been a huge success. This movement called Open Notes is now being used by 12 million people in the US alone. And almost 100% of them have reported wanting to see their notes again in the future. There have been very few cases of anyone being anxious and yelling at their doctor. And in recent years, Tom has been reporting that a lot of patients are finding mistakes in their notes and fixing them. And this is really important because these mistakes could have been potentially life-threatening in the future. And Tom wanted me to tell you one thing, which is that the slogan that underpins this movement, "Nothing about me without me," was coined by a Norwegian nurse. So he says, thank you for that. So what Tom is doing, and so many others in this field are looking towards, is the future of medicine. And it's now spread to even the traditional healthcare system. I regularly hear from hospitals and insurance companies and governments that talk about patient empowerment and patient engagement. And I like to think of it more as a patient and doctor partnership model, because I think both have an equally important role to play. And this shift is embodied by this idea that we need to start thinking, rather than what is the matter with the patient, that we should shift to what matters to the patient. And speaking of empowered patients, the guy in the baseball cap, that is Blake. I interviewed him for National Public Radio, and he lives in California. He has type 1 diabetes. And Blake was one of the most on top of it patients that I've met in my career. When I met him, he had just enrolled in a pilot program at Stanford University. And the idea is that he would take all the data that he was collecting from his glucometer about his blood sugar and compare that with what his Fitbit activity bracelet and other store-bought devices could tell him about his sleep, his steps, what he's been eating, and so on. And that data together would be read by his iPhone, which he would carry with him all the time. And with his consent, he could share that with his mom, if it wasn't too embarrassing, or potentially his doctor. And Blake told me that after a few months being enrolled in this pilot, that it changed everything for him, even though this might seem like such a simple solution. Because when he went to see his doctor, who's featured in the blue tie, the two of them could have an informed conversation about his health that was much more than educated guesswork. If there was a time that he was feeling lethargic or tired, they could look back in that log of data and see what was wrong, and together as a team make a decision about how Blake could live the healthiest life possible. So when it works, technology, especially the personal health technology that we're all using, can be a catalyst for the shift towards patient empowerment. And in Silicon Valley, there's an assumption that all of this stuff, these gadgets, are just being used by rich, healthy, curious people with too much time on their hands. But I'm finding that it's patients like Blake who have chronic conditions like heart disease and diabetes that are finding a lot of use for these tools. They can self-manage their care outside of the doctor's office now. So I think that the future of medicine isn't just patient-driven, and it's not just evidence-based, it's also distributed. It's happening everywhere, and it's happening all the time. And patients are also driving these changes when they do this very scary thing, which is to research medical information online. It is, in many ways, dangerous. I'm sure many of us in the audience, and certainly myself, have been guilty of having a headache and spending too many hours in the middle of the night on WebMD, convincing yourself by the morning that you have an incurable brain tumor. But in many cases, I'm meeting with doctors who say that their favorite kind of patient is one that has done their homework and is willing to walk into the doctor's office with some realistic ideas about how they can improve their own health. And this is especially true among the younger generation. And as we move to all of these new technologies, more patients than ever are reporting that they feel a responsibility for their own health. And this is not something that they just want to leave to their doctor to make decisions for them. This is a lot to digest, but if there's one thing that I hope you take away from this talk, it's that you have way more power than you think. Thank you.